Imagine boarding a plane, ticket in hand, excited for the journey ahead, only to be told you don't belong in the seat you paid for. Now, imagine being 12 years old, carrying not just your dreams, but the weight of an entire company you built, and having a stranger decide you're unworthy. This is what happened to Aaliyah Monroe, a young black billionaire who walked into first class expecting a quiet flight and instead found herself at the center of a storm. The man who took her seat didn't just take her space. He made it clear he thought she didn't deserve to be there. What happens when arrogance meets quiet power? When a girl refuses to be diminished, even in the face of public humiliation? And what unfolds when the world begins to watch, frame by frame, as a single flight spirals into a national conversation on belonging, dignity, and justice? Tonight, we bring you the full story, from the moment Aaliyah stepped onto Flight 472 to the instant the captain grounded the plane. If you believe stories like this matter, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe now. Let's begin. Aaliyah Monroe froze in the narrow aisle of the first-class cabin. Her left hand clutched the handle of her carry-on. Her right hand held her boarding pass so tightly that the paper had begun to crease under her fingers. Seat 2A, window, first class. The ticket had been booked 3 weeks in advance for this very trip. And yet, the seat was occupied. The man in it leaned back casually, one ankle resting on his knee, flipping through an expensive leather folio as though he had been born in that seat. His white dress shirt was perfectly pressed, his cufflinks glinting under the cabin lights. His salt and pepper hair was neatly combed, his expression one of mild impatience, as though the young black girl in the aisle was some minor inconvenience delaying his day. "Excuse me," Aaliyah said, keeping her voice polite. "I believe you're in my seat." The man glanced up, then down at her boarding pass, then back at her face. His eyes lingered for a fraction too long, cool and assessing. "This is 2A, he said flatly. "I booked this seat weeks ago." She blinked, certain she had heard him wrong. Before she could respond, a flight attendant in a crisp Navy uniform approached, smiling automatically. "Is there a problem here?" "Yes," the man said quickly, before Aaliyah could speak. "There seems to be a mix-up with the seating assignments. This young lady is in my seat." Aaliyah's lips parted. "Actually, boarding pass, please," the attendant said gently. She handed it over. The attendant scanned it, then nodded once. "Miss Monroe is correctly seated in 2A. She turned to the man. "May I see yours?" "Sir." His jaw tightened, but he handed over his pass. The attendant glanced at it. "Mr. Dalton, your assigned seat is 14C. That's Economy Plus, not first class." The reaction was instant. His face flushed. "That's absurd. I'm a platinum member." "I never fly economy. Check again." "I did," she said, her smile polite but fixed. "We are full in this cabin. If a seat opens, I'll let you know." Henry Dalton's gaze flicked back to Aaliyah, as if she were the cause of this embarrassment. "Surely," he said, his tone dropping into a measured, almost coaxing register, "there's some flexibility here. Perhaps the young lady wouldn't mind relocating. I doubt she needs the workspace as urgently as I do." The words landed like pebbles in a pond, the ripples spreading quickly through the cabin. Several passengers looked up. Some frowned, others simply watched. Aaliyah felt the heat rising to her cheeks. She had been through moments like this before: the quiet dismissal, the assumption she didn't belong, but the sting was still sharp. Before she could answer, a voice from across the aisle interrupted. "Excuse me," an older woman said. Her silver hair was swept into a neat chignon, her pearl earrings catching the light. "I couldn't help overhearing. I'm in 2C. Why don't we switch seats, Mr. Dalton? That way you can stay in first class and the young lady can keep the seat she booked." Henry turned toward her, thrown off balance by the offer. "That's..." very kind," he said slowly. But nothing," she replied, her eyes cool and sharp. No, of course, the issue isn't really the seat." Her tone was pleasant. Her meaning was not. The attendant exhaled quietly, relief flickering across her face. That would solve it. Reluctantly. Henry rose and took the aisle seat the woman vacated. Aaliyah slid into 2A, setting her carry-on under the seat in front of her, her spine straight and her movements deliberate. From 3 rows back in economy, David Monroe watched the exchange, every muscle in his jaw tight. He caught his daughter's eye. She gave him a small nod. "I'm fine," though her chest felt tight. The woman leaned over as she settled into the economy seat beside David. "Margaret Wells," she said, extending a hand, "your daughter's composure is impressive." David shook her hand, gratitude in his eyes. David Monroe. "And thank you. She shouldn't have needed rescuing in the first place," Margaret murmured. "Some people have a remarkable resistance to having their assumptions challenged." David's gaze sharpened slightly, curious about the way she said it. In 2A, Aaliyah powered up her tablet, the hum of boarding filling the air. The steady stream of passengers filed past, most oblivious to the small drama that had just unfolded. Henry Dalton across the aisle didn't look at her again, but she could feel the weight of his presence, the silent judgment. She tried to push it aside, focusing on the presentation slides she would give in Los Angeles in just a few hours. What no one yet realized, not Aaliyah, not her father, not even Margaret Wells, was that in exactly 15 minutes, this routine flight would veer into something none of them could have imagined. And the man across the aisle, the one who had just tried to take her seat, would set in motion events that would force every passenger on this plane to confront uncomfortable truths they had spent a lifetime avoiding. The house was still and quiet when Aaliyah Monroe opened her eyes. She always woke before the alarm, especially on travel days. Outside her bedroom window, the early winter sky glowed faintly, a muted blue-gray that meant dawn was still deciding whether to arrive. Her room was a strange blend of childhood and empire. On one wall, shelves held stacks of programming manuals, VR headsets, and 3D printed prototypes. On the other, a bulletin board was covered in sketches for projects she had been developing for Luminary Learning. Her company, a soft plush elephant, sat in the corner of her bed, a reminder from her 6th birthday that she never had the heart to pack away. She slipped out from under the quilt and padded to her desk, pulling her hair back into a ponytail. Her tablet lit up at her touch. Overnight, a partner school in Nairobi had sent feedback on her latest module for visually impaired students. She scrolled through their notes, her mind already busy with ideas. From the hallway came the smell of coffee, her father's signal. She grabbed a hoodie and padded toward the kitchen. David Monroe was standing by the counter, a steaming mug in his hand. His salt and pepper beard was trimmed neatly, but there was a faint weariness in his eyes that came from too many late nights and early mornings. "Morning, superstar," he said, sliding a warm mug of cocoa toward her. "You ready for today? As ready as I can be," she replied, wrapping her fingers around the cup. I don't know how they're going to react." They meant the group of investors she would be meeting in Los Angeles later that day. People who had never met her in person, people who had only seen the numbers her company produced, and perhaps still pictured someone older, taller, and not her. "You mean react to meeting a 12-year-old black CEO in first class?" David's tone was light, but his eyes stayed on her. She gave a small shrug. "You said it, not me." He took a slow sip of coffee. "Look, their reaction is their problem. Your job is to show them why you're here, and you've been doing that since you were 9. Her lips quirked into the faintest smile. "I know. It's just..." Sometimes it feels like the real work is convincing people I deserve to be in the room before I even get to do the work I came for. David's gaze softened. Aaliyah, every room you walk into, you've earned. Don't let anyone make you feel like you're a guest in your own story. They sat in comfortable silence for a few minutes, sipping their drinks. On the counter beside them, 2 neatly packed suitcases waited. David had booked his seat in economy for this trip, not because he couldn't sit in first class, but because he wanted her to navigate the space on her own. They both knew it was partly a lesson and partly a test. At 5:15, they stepped out into the crisp morning air, their driver already waiting. Chicago was just beginning to stir, the streetlights still glowing against the quiet sidewalks. The ride to the airport was uneventful until Aaliyah's phone buzzed with a message from Clara Reeves, Luminary's chief operating officer. Boarding pass secured. I'll be in row 22. Call me if you need anything before we land. Aaliyah smiled. Clara had been with Luminary since its earliest days, a steady presence in the chaos of running a company, even when she was out of sight. Aaliyah knew Clara was always working in the background to make sure she was safe. By the time they reached O'Hare International, the terminal was alive with travelers. The rhythmic click of rolling suitcases filled the air. Overhead announcements called out boarding groups in a calm but firm voice. David walked her to the security line. You've got your ID, boarding pass, and presentation file. She patted her satchel. All here. I'll see you at the gate. You'll see me in the economy cabin, pretending not to eavesdrop on your every move, he said with a grin. She laughed, shaking her head, and stepped forward in line. The TSA agent glanced from her ID to her face, then back again, eyebrows lifting slightly at the title on her boarding pass, First Class. But he said nothing, waving her through. She moved briskly toward the gate, the crowd parting around her. She had learned to walk like she belonged, even when she could feel eyes on her. At the gate, the attendant scanned her pass and smiled warmly. Welcome aboard, Miss Monroe. Enjoy your flight. She offered a small thank you and stepped onto the jet bridge. The scent of jet fuel and the cool metallic tang of the enclosed walkway hit her senses. Ahead, the open aircraft door framed the cabin like the beginning of a stage play. The first-class section was small and bright, with wide leather seats and crisp white headrest covers. She found 2A easily, sliding her bag under the seat and pulling out her tablet. A moment later, Margaret Wells arrived and took the seat across the aisle. She wore a soft gray cardigan over a cream blouse, her movements deliberate, her gaze quietly attentive. Big day, Margaret asked, her voice carrying the calm cadence of someone who had been in 1,000 such cabins before. You could say that, Aaliyah replied with a polite smile. Margaret nodded but said nothing more, returning to her book. As boarding continued, Aaliyah opened her presentation file, scanning the slides one last time. The rhythmic shuffle of passengers passing through the cabin became background noise. She didn't notice the absence of the man who would later arrive and challenge her presence. Not yet. For now, the morning was still just another travel day. But somewhere deep down, that faint unease from earlier still lingered. She could not name it, but she could feel it. And before the sun reached its full height over Chicago, she would know exactly why. The steady hum of boarding filled the cabin as passengers moved down the narrow aisle in a slow, polite shuffle. Aaliyah Monroe adjusted her seatbelt and opened her tablet again, trying to focus on her slides. Her heart rate had settled since the morning's quiet rush through O'Hare, but the low buzz of anticipation still hummed under her skin. Across the aisle, Margaret Wells had settled into her seat in 2C. She was still reading the same hardcover book, a silver bookmark glinting in the corner of the page. Every so often, Her eyes flicked over the top of her glasses toward the boarding line, like she was cataloging each passenger as they passed. From the economy cabin, a faint laugh drifted forward. Aaliyah recognized her father's voice instantly. She pictured him chatting with the middle-aged man next to him, probably swapping travel tips or talking about sports. David had an easy way of making people comfortable, even at 30,000 feet. The line slowed as a family with 2 toddlers tried to get their bags stowed. Aaliyah glanced at the time. Still 10 minutes to departure. She exhaled and returned to her slides. Then she heard the voice. It was smooth but clipped, a tone used by people accustomed to getting what they wanted. "Excuse me, that's my seat," the man said, somewhere just behind her row. She looked up and saw him tall, well-dressed, carrying a sleek black briefcase in one hand and a navy blazer folded over the other arm. His hair was peppered with gray at the temples, and he moved like someone who believed the cabin was his territory. The man's gaze landed on her seat, then on her, and the faintest crease formed between his brows. He glanced at his boarding pass, then back at her. "This is 2A, he said firmly, as if reciting an unassailable fact. "Yes," Aaliyah replied, keeping her voice calm. "It's my seat." A flight attendant approached, her steps brisk. "Is there a problem here?" "There's been a mix-up," the man said, turning to the attendant. "I'm supposed to be in this seat. I fly this route all the time." The attendant's smile stayed fixed. "May I see your boarding pass?" "Sir." He handed it over without hesitation. She scanned it, then looked up. "Mr. Dalton, your assigned seat is 14C in Economy Plus." His mouth tightened. "That's ridiculous. I booked first class. I have work to do. This seat is mine." "I'm sorry, sir, but the system shows 14C. We are full in first class today." Aaliyah felt the tension spread like static in the air. A few passengers in nearby rows shifted in their seats, their conversations fading as they listened. Henry Dalton. She caught the name from the attendant's tone, looked back at her again. "Perhaps," he said, in a voice that carried just enough for the row behind them to hear, "the young lady would be willing to switch. I'm sure she would be more comfortable in Economy Plus." The words were not overtly rude, but the meaning was sharp. Her hands tightened on her tablet. "I'm fine where I am," she said, her voice steady. "Sir," the attendant interjected, "if a seat opens up in first class, I will let you know. For now, please take your assigned seat so we can continue boarding." Dalton hesitated, clearly weighing whether to push further. That was when Margaret Wells closed her book with a quiet but decisive snap. "Mr. Dalton, was it?" she asked, her tone polite but edged with steel. "I'm in 2C. "Why don't we trade? You can stay in first class, and the young lady can keep her seat as booked." The man blinked, caught off guard. "That's generous, but unnecessary." Margaret tilted her head slightly. "Unless the issue is not actually the seat." A small murmur rippled through the cabin. Dalton's jaw flexed. Without a word, he nodded once and moved into Margaret's former seat. The attendant gave a small, relieved smile and stepped away. Boarding resumed, though the air still felt charged. Aaliyah focused on her screen, refusing to look across the aisle. She could feel his presence there, his silent disapproval. From row 22, Clara Reeves leaned forward, her keen eyes scanning the exchange. She made a mental note to check in with Aaliyah after landing. Years of working in high-pressure situations had taught her to spot when something small could spiral into something much larger. David, watching from economy, sat back in his seat but kept his attention forward. He had promised to let Aaliyah handle first class on her own, but his instincts told him to stay alert. The intercom crackled to life, and the captain's voice welcomed passengers aboard. Cabin crew made final checks, securing bags and closing overhead bins. As the plane pushed back from the gate, Aaliyah tried to shake the lingering discomfort. She told herself this was just another travel hiccup, nothing more. But deep down, she sensed there was something different about this man, and the way he had looked at her, like her very presence in that seat, was a disruption to the natural order. Margaret returned to her book, but every so often, her gaze slid over the edge of the page toward Dalton. She had seen men like him before. She knew when someone's ego had been bruised and when that bruise might fester into something worse. And she knew that this flight was far from over. The plane leveled off, the deep hum of the engines filling the cabin. Aaliyah Monroe opened her tablet again, forcing herself to focus on the slides for her presentation in Los Angeles. She adjusted her seat slightly, letting her shoulders drop. The earlier confrontation still clung to her like static electricity, invisible but impossible to shake. She could feel Henry Dalton's presence across the aisle without even looking at him. The occasional rustle of his folio or the click of his pen felt like tiny reminders that he was still there, still occupying a space that had been offered to him only because someone else had stepped aside. Margaret Wells seemed unbothered by her new seat in Economy Plus. Every so often, Aaliyah caught sight of her through the small gap between the seats ahead, her silver hair gleaming under the cabin lights. Margaret had a posture that spoke of self-possession, as if a seat assignment could not possibly determine her value. Aaliyah envied that. She took a slow breath and swiped to the next slide, a graph showing projected adoption rates for Luminary Learning's latest program. The numbers were strong, but she knew the investors would want more than data. They would want to see her composure. They would want to see if she could handle pressure without flinching. Her father's voice echoed in her mind. "You have earned every room you step into." Across the aisle. Dalton shifted in his seat. She saw the movement from the corner of her eye, but kept her gaze locked on her screen. "You must be a student." Dalton's voice broke into her focus, low enough that only she could hear. "I am," she replied without looking up. "And I'm also working." He gave a small, dry laugh. "Traveling alone for school, or is Daddy along somewhere in the cabin?" Her eyes lifted to meet his. His expression was smooth, almost pleasant, but there was a glint of something sharper beneath it. "My father is here," she said evenly. "But this trip is for work." He raised an eyebrow. "Work at your age?" She closed her tablet slowly, setting it on her lap. "Yes, at my age." For a moment, neither spoke. Then Dalton leaned back, smiling faintly, as though indulging a child's fantasy. Aaliyah turned back to her screen, her jaw tight. She had learned long ago not to give people like him the satisfaction of seeing her rattle. 2 rows back, Clara Reeves noticed the exchange. She could not hear the words, but she saw the body language, the slight lean toward Aaliyah, the measured way Aaliyah kept her posture straight. Clara opened her notebook and jotted something down. If this kept up, she would intervene. In economy. David Monroe kept his eyes forward, pretending to read an in-flight magazine, but he was watching the reflection in the polished surface of the bulkhead in front of him. Years of boardrooms and negotiation tables had taught him how to listen without seeming to listen, to observe without drawing attention. The flight attendant returned with a tray of drinks for the first-class cabin. She paused at Aaliyah's seat. "Can I get you something? Miss Monroe, water?" "Please," Aaliyah replied. Dalton ordered a scotch. He took the glass when it arrived, swirling the amber liquid before taking a slow sip. The quiet returned. But it was not a peaceful quiet. It was the kind of silence that hummed with unspoken things, the kind that could be broken by a single careless word. Margaret's voice carried faintly from the back, speaking to another passenger. Aaliyah thought about what Margaret had done earlier, stepping in without hesitation, It was not something most strangers would do. She wondered why. A sudden turbulence rattled the cabin. The seatbelt sign chimed on, and a few passengers murmured in discomfort. Aaliyah gripped the armrest briefly, then forced herself to relax. Dalton set his glass down and glanced at her. Nervous flyer. "Not at all," she said. He smiled faintly. "Good. You'll need steady nerves in the world you seem to think you're part of." Her gaze sharpened. "The world I am part of." The words hung there for a moment, heavier than the air around them. Dalton gave a small shrug and looked away. From the galley, the faint sound of the flight attendants preparing the meal service drifted forward. The smell of warming bread rolls and coffee began to fill the air. Aaliyah reopened her tablet. She focused on her notes, blocking out the subtle provocations. But she could not shake the feeling that this man was not simply irritated about a seat. Some people saw her and questioned her qualifications. Others saw her and questioned her right to exist in certain spaces at all. She suspected Dalton was the latter. As the plane cut smoothly through the air, the atmosphere in the cabin felt deceptively calm. Yet, somewhere in that calm was the promise of something breaking, and she had the sinking sense that whatever it was would happen before they landed in Los Angeles. The meal service began quietly enough. The clink of cutlery, the muted rustle of napkins, and the low murmur of polite conversation filled the first-class cabin. Aaliyah Monroe accepted her tray with a polite thank you. She was not especially hungry, but she knew eating would give her something to do besides think about the man across the aisle. She picked at the fresh salad, glancing briefly at the warm bread roll wrapped in a cloth napkin. Henry Dalton was not eating. Instead, he nursed another glass of scotch. His gaze fixed out the window. Every so often, he would jot something down in his leather folio, as though compiling a list of grievances. Across the aisle, Margaret Wells was nowhere in sight now. She had disappeared into the economy cabin after the seat swap, leaving Aaliyah without the silent anchor she had felt earlier. Clara Reeves remained in her seat further back, eyes occasionally flicking toward the first-class curtain whenever a ripple of tension disturbed the cabin's quiet. David Monroe was still in economy, chatting amiably with his seatmate, but his body language was deceptively casual. He was listening. He had not missed the way Dalton had leaned toward Aaliyah earlier, or the faint stiffness in her shoulders now. The flight attendant returned to offer coffee or tea. Aaliyah requested water. Dalton gestured for another drink. As the attendant stepped away, Dalton spoke, his voice pitched low but carrying across the narrow aisle. "I hope your little vacation is worth it," he said, without looking at her. Aaliyah froze. "Excuse me." He glanced over, his smile faint and tight. "First class is wasted on people who are just here for the novelty. Seats like these should go to people who understand the value of them." She set her fork down. "I understand value just fine." Dalton chuckled softly, the sound dismissive. "I doubt it, but you'll learn. Life has a way of showing people their place." Something inside her shifted then. She had dealt with condescension before. But there was something in his tone, not just arrogance, but certainty. The certainty of a man who believed the order of the world was fixed, and that she was a trespasser in it. From row 22, Clara saw Aaliyah's head tilt slightly, her shoulders squaring. That was the look Aaliyah got before she said something that could not be taken back. Clara unbuckled her seatbelt. Aaliyah's voice was calm when she spoke. "Mr. Dalton, I am not here for a vacation. I am on this flight because I am traveling for work. I booked my seat. I paid for my seat. I have every right to be here." A few passengers in nearby rows paused their meals, sensing the shift in tone. Dalton leaned back, swirling the liquid in his glass. "Work. Right. "And what exactly is it that you do?" She held his gaze. "I run a company." His eyebrows lifted in exaggerated surprise. "You run a company?" "Yes," she said evenly. "A global education technology firm. We design learning tools for students in underserved communities. We've partnered with schools in more than 30 countries." Dalton stared at her for a long moment, then laughed. It was not a laugh of amusement, but one of disbelief. "You expect me to believe that you can believe whatever you want," she said, "but it will not change the truth." The quiet in the cabin deepened. Even the hum of the engines seemed softer, as though the plane itself was listening. Dalton's smile thinned. "This world is built on experience." "Miss, what is it again, Monroe?" She replied. "Miss Monroe," he continued, "this world is built on experience, not idealism. You cannot just decide you belong in places like this. It is earned." "I agree," she said, her voice steady, "and I have earned it many times over." For a moment, Dalton seemed to study her, as though trying to find a crack in her composure. Then he looked away, muttering something under his breath. It was just loud enough for her to catch two words: "Lucky break." Her pulse quickened, but she forced herself to take a slow sip of water. She would not give him the satisfaction of reacting in anger. That was when Clara arrived, stepping quietly into the aisle. "Miss Monroe," she said warmly, "we need to review your talking points for the presentation." "Do you mind if I sit for a moment?" Aaliyah shook her head, grateful for the interruption. Clara slid into the empty jump seat near the galley, angled so she could face Aaliyah without blocking the aisle. As they spoke, Clara kept her tone professional, but her eyes watchful. She saw the flicker of irritation in Dalton's expression, the slight tightening of his grip on his glass. David, still in economy, saw Clara's presence and relaxed slightly. If Clara was involved, nothing would spiral without being noticed. The rest of the meal passed in strained quiet. Dalton said nothing more, though his occasional glances in Aaliyah's direction were not friendly. When the trays were cleared, Aaliyah leaned back in her seat and closed her eyes for a moment. She could feel the tension still coiled in her chest, but she also felt something else resolve. She had dealt with worse than Henry Dalton, and if he thought a few condescending remarks could make her question her place, he was going to be very disappointed. Still, a part of her wondered why he seemed so invested in undermining her. People like him rarely wasted energy without a reason. She decided to keep her guard up. The flight was far from over. The cabin lights dimmed slightly as the flight attendants prepared for the mid-cruise portion of the flight. The hum of the engines had settled into a steady background rhythm. Most passengers leaned back into their seats, some watching movies, others reading. Aaliyah Monroe had her tablet open again, the glow reflecting off her calm but focused face. Clara Reeves had returned to her seat but kept a careful eye on first class. David Monroe still sat in economy, flipping through a magazine, though his posture remained alert. Henry Dalton sat across the aisle, tapping at his phone. His jaw was tight, his lips pressed in a line. He had barely spoken since the meal service, but the air around him felt heavier now. The quiet broke when Dalton chuckled under his breath. It was not a laugh of amusement, more like the release of irritation that had been simmering too long. Aaliyah did not look up, but she could feel the weight of his attention on her. "Do you know what bothers me the most?" Dalton's voice rose just enough for the row behind to hear. "The way some people think a lucky break makes them equal to those who worked their entire lives to be here." A few passengers glanced up. Aaliyah kept her eyes on her tablet, but her grip on the stylus tightened. Dalton was not done. And the arrogance of sitting there as if you belong, without even an ounce of gratitude. The woman in 3B shifted uncomfortably, glancing at Aaliyah. Across the aisle in row 3, a man paused his movie and pulled off his headphones. Aaliyah closed her tablet slowly and set it in the seat pocket. Her voice, when she spoke, was quiet but carried. "Mr. Dalton, you do not know me. You do not know what I have worked for or sacrificed to be here." Dalton smiled without warmth. "I know entitlement when I see it." Clara stood from her seat in the second row of business class and stepped forward. "Mr. Dalton, that's enough," she said evenly. "Your comments are inappropriate." He turned toward her with mock surprise. "Oh, so now we are policing conversation. I am merely expressing an opinion." The flight attendant nearest them approached, her professional smile masking a sharp edge. "Sir, we need to keep the cabin environment respectful for all passengers." Dalton scoffed. "Respect works both ways. I paid for first class. I expect to sit among peers, not—" His voice trailed off, but the implication was clear. A murmur ran through the cabin. The man in 3D muttered, "Unbelievable." The woman in 2F shook her head, her eyes on Aaliyah with a mix of sympathy and frustration. Margaret Wells appeared then, returning from the rear cabin. She stood in the aisle between them, her posture tall, her gaze sharp. "Mr. Dalton, you are embarrassing yourself." Dalton's jaw clenched. "I am stating facts." "No," Margaret said, her tone cutting through the low hum of voices. "You are stating prejudice, and doing it loudly enough for strangers to witness." The flight attendant's radio crackled softly, a voice from the cockpit asking if assistance was needed. She pressed the transmit button and gave a brief, coded reply. Aaliyah sat very still, her expression calm, but her heartbeat quick. This was no longer a private exchange. It was public now. Every word was being heard, remembered, and judged. Dalton's face reddened slightly. He looked at Margaret, then back at Aaliyah. "You think you are untouchable, don't you?" Aaliyah's voice was steady. "I think everyone deserves to be treated with dignity, even people who have yet to extend it to others." That landed harder than she expected. Dalton's mouth opened, then shut again. David Monroe, still in economy, stood. He made his way toward the first-class curtain, but before he could step through, Clara gave a small shake of her head. She wanted Aaliyah to finish this herself if she chose to. The attendant stepped forward again. "Mr. Dalton, I am asking you to lower your voice and refrain from any further personal remarks toward other passengers. This is your final warning." Dalton gave a short, bitter laugh. "Final warning. On a flight I paid for." Margaret did not move. "On a flight you share with others," she said. "You are not the only one who paid to be here." For a long moment, Dalton said nothing. The tension stretched taut. Then he looked away, muttering under his breath again. The flight attendant nodded slightly to Aaliyah, then stepped back toward the galley. Clara returned to her seat, but her gaze never left the first-class cabin. Aaliyah leaned back, her pulse still elevated, but her breathing even. She glanced once at Margaret, who gave her the faintest nod before sitting down. The confrontation was over, at least for now, but the look in Dalton's eyes told her he had not let it go. She picked up her tablet again, though she barely looked at the screen. Instead, she thought about how quickly a quiet flight could become a stage for something larger. Dalton's words would not follow her home, but the attitude behind them was something she had encountered in boardrooms, conferences, and negotiations. It was the shadow that followed her into every space where someone assumed she was there by accident. And she knew, deep down, that this was not the end of it. The hum of the engines was steady, but the air in first class felt different now. It was taut, stretched thin after the earlier confrontation. Aaliyah Monroe kept her gaze on her tablet, but her mind was not on the slides anymore. She was listening, waiting, knowing instinctively that Henry Dalton was not finished. Dalton sat rigid in his seat, arms crossed. His glass of scotch was empty. He stared out the window, but every so often his eyes flicked toward her, the kind of look that carried weight without a word being spoken. Clara Reeves was 2 rows behind, scrolling through her phone, though her attention was fixed on the front cabin. She had seen men like Dalton before they simmered, they brooded, and then they erupted when they thought the world was no longer watching. Margaret Wells was in her seat again, hands folded in her lap, posture straight. She had said her piece earlier, but she was still watching. The flight attendant moved quietly through the aisle, checking seat belts and refilling water glasses. She had been in this job long enough to know when trouble was not over. It began with a sigh. Dalton's voice followed almost immediately. "It is amazing what passes for professionalism these days," he said, not looking at anyone in particular. The woman in 3B turned her head slightly. The man in 2F gave a small shake of his head, as if telling Dalton to let it go. But he did not. Children playing CEO, buying their way into spaces they have no business in. Aaliyah looked up slowly. She did not answer. She knew anything she said now would give him an opening. Dalton leaned forward in his seat, elbows on his knees, his gaze fixed on her. "Do you even know what it takes to build something from the ground up, or did Daddy's checkbook make it easier?" The words hit harder than she expected, not because they were true, they were not, but because of the way he said them. The dismissal was complete, as though every late night, every difficult decision, every risk she had taken was invisible to him. Her father was in economy, but she knew he would have heard the change in Dalton's tone if he were close. She imagined his jaw tightening, his hands curling slightly on the armrests. Clara stood up again, walking to the front. "That is enough," she said firmly. "You will stop speaking to her like that." Dalton turned toward Clara, his voice rising. She put herself in this position. If she cannot handle criticism— "This is not criticism," Margaret interrupted, her voice cutting cleanly across his. "This is harassment." Dalton laughed, short and sharp. "Harassment. Please, we are just having a conversation." "No," Clara said, her voice steady. "You are trying to humiliate her, and you are doing it loudly enough for half the cabin to hear." The flight attendant stepped forward, her expression neutral, but her tone firm. "Mr. Dalton, I am going to ask you to lower your voice and refrain from any further personal remarks." Dalton's eyes narrowed. "Or what? Or I will escalate this to the captain," she replied. That was when Dalton made his mistake. He stood, not all the way, but enough to lean over the aisle toward Aaliyah. "You think you are special because you have money and a title, but you are just a girl in an expensive seat. And when the world stops indulging you, you will learn exactly where you belong." The words landed like stones in the still air. A few passengers gasped softly. The man in 3D muttered, "That's it." Clara stepped closer. "Back to your seat. Now." The flight attendant reached for her radio, pressing the button. "Captain, this is forward cabin. We need you to be aware of a passenger situation." Dalton sank back into his seat, muttering under his breath. But the damage was done. The cabin was no longer simply tense, it was divided. Some passengers were clearly uncomfortable with Dalton's words. Others looked like they were trying to avoid involvement. Aaliyah sat perfectly still. She could feel her pulse in her fingertips, but her face remained calm. She would not let him see the effect his words had. Margaret leaned forward slightly, speaking just loudly enough for Aaliyah to hear, "Do not let him take your ground. Aaliyah gave a small nod. 2 minutes later, the captain's voice came over the intercom. Calm, steady, professional. Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We are aware of a situation in the forward cabin. I want to remind everyone that this is a shared space, and all passengers are expected to treat each other with respect. The crew's instructions are to be followed at all times. Dalton shifted in his seat, clearly not enjoying the attention. The flight attendant returned with a small form and a pen. She handed it to Dalton. Sir, I am documenting this incident. Please fill this out. He stared at the paper. You are serious? Yes, sir. Dalton scrawled something on the page, then shoved it back at her. Aaliyah reopened her tablet, more as a statement than out of interest in her work. She wanted it clear that she was still here, still composed, still doing exactly what she came to do. From economy. David finally stepped forward, slipping through the curtain into first class. He walked down the aisle, stopping beside his daughter's seat. You all right, yes? She said softly. I am fine. Dalton looked at David, then back at Aaliyah. For a moment, something like recognition flickered in his expression, but it vanished as quickly as it came. David's gaze lingered on Dalton just long enough to make the man look away. Then he returned to his seat in economy. The rest of the cabin remained quiet. Too quiet. Everyone was waiting to see what would happen next. And Aaliyah knew something had shifted. Dalton had crossed a line that could not be uncrossed. Whatever happened from here, the flight was no longer just a trip from New York to Los Angeles. It was something else now. Something bigger. The first-class curtain swayed slightly as a figure emerged from the cockpit. The captain walked with the kind of measured authority that made people straighten in their seats without realizing it. His uniform was immaculate, his hat tucked neatly under one arm. Good evening, he began, his voice calm but carrying clearly over the soft hum of the engines. I understand there has been a disruption in this cabin. Every head turned. Some passengers looked relieved, others wary. Henry Dalton shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his expression unreadable. The captain's gaze swept the cabin, pausing briefly on Aaliyah Monroe, then moving to Dalton. We cannot and will not tolerate behavior that makes other passengers feel unsafe or unwelcome. This is not just airline policy. This is basic human decency. Dalton opened his mouth as if to protest, but the captain raised a hand slightly. I have already spoken with the lead flight attendant. I have reviewed the written incident report. I am here to make one thing clear. This ends now. The words carried a weight that made even the most inattentive passengers look up from their screens. Dalton gave a stiff nod, but his eyes slid toward Aaliyah, as though the very fact of her presence was an affront. The captain turned to her. Miss Monroe, has anything occurred since the last crew report? Aaliyah met his gaze steadily. No, Captain, nothing further. He studied her for a moment, as if reading not just her words, but her composure. If anything changes, you let the crew know immediately. She nodded. I will. With that, the captain looked back to Dalton. Sir, I am instructing you to remain in your seat, to refrain from any personal remarks toward other passengers, and to limit your interaction with others unless it is courteous. If you cannot agree to that, I will have no choice but to divert this flight. Dalton's jaw tightened. Understood, he said finally. The captain held his gaze for a beat longer, then nodded to the flight attendant and returned to the cockpit. The curtain fell back into place, but the energy in the cabin had shifted. Some passengers relaxed into their seats again, reassured by the captain's intervention. Others kept watching Dalton, wary of his next move. Clara Reeves returned to her seat, but her phone was in her hand now. She had opened a document, her fingers moving quickly across the screen. Clara was not just a COO, she was also a strategist, and she was documenting every word, every exchange, every action taken. Margaret Wells leaned slightly toward Aaliyah. "That was handled well," she said quietly. "Not every captain would address a situation like that personally." Aaliyah allowed herself a small smile. It was clear in economy. David Monroe exhaled slowly. The captain's presence meant the situation was officially logged, which meant there would be a trail. Dalton might think this was over, but in reality, every move he made from here on out would be under scrutiny. For a while, the cabin settled. The service resumed. Passengers resumed quiet conversations or turned back to their movies. Aaliyah sipped water, her posture relaxed but her mind still alert. She was not the kind of person to dwell on conflict, but she also knew when a confrontation had not truly ended. Dalton had agreed to the captain's terms because he had no choice. That did not mean he had accepted them. Her instincts proved right when, 20 minutes later, she heard the faint scrape of his seat belt buckle. Dalton stood slowly, stretching as if easing stiffness from his legs. He stepped into the aisle and began walking toward the rear of the first-class cabin. His movements were casual, but Aaliyah noticed the way his eyes lingered on her as he passed. The flight attendant in the galley glanced up, subtly shifting to block his view as he moved further back. A few minutes later, Dalton returned, settling into his seat without a word. But there was a faint smirk on his face now, like a man who believed he had found a loophole. Clara's phone buzzed with a short message from one of the attendants. She read it, frowned, and sent a quick reply. Margaret noticed. "Something happened?" she asked under her breath. Clara nodded once. He was talking to a couple of passengers in the galley. Not loudly, but enough to plant seeds. Margaret's lips thinned. Seeds about who Aaliyah is, about why she's here, and why, in his opinion, she doesn't belong. Margaret glanced toward Dalton. He was leaning back now, eyes closed as though he had not just tried to undermine someone from 30 feet away. Aaliyah kept her attention on her tablet, but she caught the exchange between Clara and Margaret. She did not need to hear every word to know the gist. She thought about ignoring it. She thought about letting it slide, but she also knew what silence sometimes meant: permission. When the attendant passed by again, Aaliyah spoke quietly. "If Mr. Dalton says anything about me to other passengers, I want it noted." The attendant nodded without hesitation. "It already is." The formality of the process was oddly comforting. It meant this was no longer just an unpleasant moment in the air. It was becoming part of a record. The cabin lights dimmed again as the flight entered its last third. Outside, the sky was a deep indigo, streaked with the last traces of sunset. Inside, the tension remained, quiet but undeniable. Dalton kept his seat, but there was a restless energy about him now. He tapped his fingers against the armrest, shifted in his chair, adjusted his watch. A man looking for an opening. Aaliyah kept her breathing steady. She had faced more than this in boardrooms full of doubters. She had negotiated deals with men twice Dalton's age and experience. But the difference here was that there was no exit, no stepping out into the hall, no cooling off before returning. This was 35,000 feet above the ground, and every second of it mattered. When the attendant passed by again, she handed Aaliyah a small folded note. Inside were 5 words in neat handwriting. "He will test you again." Aaliyah folded the note without reaction, slipping it into the seat pocket. She already knew. The cabin had grown quiet again, but it was the kind of quiet that felt temporary, Conversations were muted, eyes flicking occasionally toward Henry Dalton. The captain's warning still hung in the air, but so did Dalton's restless energy. Aaliyah Monroe sat with her tablet propped on the tray table, the stylus moving slowly over the screen. She was working on a new design for Luminary Learning's digital library interface, but her mind was split between the project and the man 2 rows away who had made it his mission to disrupt her flight. Dalton leaned back in his seat, eyes half closed, fingers drumming on the armrest. He had the air of someone calculating his next move. Margaret Wells glanced up from her book, her eyes narrowing slightly. She had lived long enough to recognize when trouble was not finished. Clara Reeves sat forward, elbows on her knees, phone in hand. She was already in a silent text exchange with one of the flight attendants, keeping track of any movement Dalton made. It happened during the second drink service. The flight attendant wheeled the cart up the aisle, offering beverages. Dalton ordered another scotch. He downed it quickly, then leaned toward the attendant with a low voice that was not quite low enough. "I am still amazed they let anyone in here these days," he said, his glance flicking toward Aaliyah. "Used to be, you had to earn it." The attendant's expression did not change, but she noted his words on the incident log she carried in her apron pocket. Aaliyah heard it. She did not flinch, but her stylus paused mid-stroke. Clara's head came up sharply. Margaret closed her book. The attendant moved on, but Dalton's voice followed, pitched just enough to carry to the rows behind him. "The whole world is bending over backwards to hand out seats to people who never fought for them." Clara stood, moving into the aisle. "That is enough, Mr. Dalton." He turned toward her with a slow smile. "Oh, are we policing thoughts now? Maybe we should just hand everyone a script before they board." Margaret's voice came from across the aisle, calm but firm. "You are not being silenced. You are being told to stop harassing someone." Dalton laughed softly. Harassment. The favorite word when someone hears a truth they do not like. By now, a few passengers in business class were craning their necks toward the first-class cabin. The tension was no longer contained to one section of the plane. The flight attendant stepped forward, radio in hand. "Captain, we have continued verbal harassment from the same passenger in first class." Dalton shook his head in mock disbelief. Verbal harassment? For speaking my mind, the captain's voice crackled over the radio. "Document every word. I am on my way." Dalton's smirk faltered for the first time. Aaliyah finally looked up, meeting his gaze. Her voice was steady. "Mr. Dalton, you can keep trying to reduce me to a seat number or a last name, but it will not work. I know who I am. The only person you are exposing right now is yourself." The murmur in the cabin grew louder. Someone in 2F said softly, "Good for her." Dalton opened his mouth to respond, but the curtain parted and the captain entered the cabin again, his presence as sharp as before. "Mr. Dalton," the captain said evenly, "you were given clear instructions. You have ignored them. At this point, I have the authority to remove you from this flight or to divert to the nearest airport." Dalton blinked. "You cannot be serious." "I am," the captain replied, "and I will make my decision based on the safety and comfort of the other passengers." A hush fell over the cabin. Dalton looked around as if expecting someone to speak up for him, but the faces that met his gaze were closed off, unsympathetic. "This is ridiculous," Dalton muttered. The captain gestured toward the aisle. "Stand up, sir." Dalton hesitated. "You are going to humiliate me in front of the whole plane. You have done that to yourself," the captain said. "Stand up." The attendant stepped forward with a calm but firm hand on Dalton's arm. After a long moment, he rose from his seat. The captain motioned for him to follow toward the forward galley. As they walked past, Dalton glanced back at Aaliyah. There was no apology in his eyes, only the stubborn refusal to see what he had done wrong. When they disappeared into the galley, the cabin exhaled. Conversations started again in low voices. Clara sat back in her seat, her shoulders easing slightly. Margaret leaned toward Aaliyah. "You handled that with more grace than most adults could." Aaliyah smiled faintly. "It was never about me. It was about him showing who he really is." 15 minutes later, the captain returned. "Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your patience. The situation in the forward cabin has been resolved. We will be continuing to Los Angeles without further interruption." He did not elaborate, but the empty seat where Dalton had been said enough. The rest of the flight settled into a calm that felt almost fragile. Aaliyah returned to her work, though she found herself staring out the window more than at the tablet. The stars outside seemed closer up here, the dark sky deep and endless. Clara tapped her on the arm. "You know this will not end when we land." "I know," Aaliyah said, "but at least now it will be on record." Margaret gave a small smile. And records have a way of speaking louder than arguments. The empty seat where Henry Dalton had been was a silent reminder of the hours before. No one in first class spoke about it openly, but the weight of what had happened was still in the air. The hum of the engines felt almost louder now, the kind of sound that filled the spaces people left when they stopped talking. Aaliyah Monroe sat back in her seat, her tablet resting dark on the tray table. She had stopped working for now. Her mind was replaying the moments, not because she wanted to dwell on Dalton's words, but because she knew they had triggered something much larger than one man's arrogance. Clara Reeves was still typing on her phone, fingers quick and precise. She had sent a detailed account of the incident to the company's legal team. Margaret Wells watched her for a moment before leaning over and asking quietly. Already getting ahead of this, Clara nodded. "We cannot let this be a passing story that fades before people understand what really happened. In economy..." David Monroe was speaking with a flight attendant who had come to check on him. His voice was low but steady. "I just want to make sure there will be no more issues for my daughter." The attendant gave a reassuring smile. "The captain has made it very clear the rest of the flight will be uneventful." But it was not going to be uneventful in the way most passengers expected. 20 minutes after Dalton had been escorted to the galley, the captain's voice came over the intercom again. It was calm, but there was a weight to it that made every ear tune in. "Ladies and gentlemen, we have been in contact with ground operations in Los Angeles. Due to the incident earlier in the flight, and in line with federal passenger safety guidelines, this aircraft will be met at the gate by security personnel. Please remain seated after we arrive until instructed by the crew." The words settled over the cabin like a thin sheet of frost. There was a murmur from the back, some passengers leaning to whisper to their seatmates. "In first class." Margaret set her book aside. Clara's eyes flicked to Aaliyah, reading her reaction. Aaliyah simply nodded. She had expected as much. The rest of the flight seemed to stretch. The attendants moved through quietly, securing the cabin for descent. Outside, the city lights of Los Angeles began to appear, scattered pinpoints against the black. David slipped back into first class for the landing, taking the seat beside his daughter. His hand rested briefly on her arm. "You all right? I am fine," she said, and she meant it, though there was a current of anticipation beneath her calm. As the wheels touched down, there was the usual jolt and rumble, but instead of the normal rush to stand and collect bags, the cabin stayed still. The seatbelt sign remained lit. From her window, Aaliyah could see them. 4 security officers waiting on the jet bridge, their reflective vests catching the glow from the terminal. Behind them, two individuals in plain clothes who carried themselves like investigators. The door opened with a hiss. The lead flight attendant spoke softly into the intercom. "Mr. Dalton, please collect your belongings and proceed to the front of the aircraft." There was a pause, then movement. Dalton emerged from the forward galley, his face pale but his expression stubborn. His jacket was draped over one arm. He did not look at anyone as he walked past, but his steps were slow, deliberate. The captain stood by the door, speaking briefly to the security team as Dalton stepped into the jet bridge. The plainclothes individuals followed. The door closed again. Aaliyah exhaled, not in relief exactly, but in recognition that one chapter of this was over, but another was beginning. Clara leaned close. "The press will pick this up fast. We need to be ready." Margaret glanced between them. "You know they will twist it. They will make it about inconvenience instead of what really happened." Aaliyah met her gaze. "Then we will make sure they hear the truth." The seatbelt sign pinged off. Passengers began standing, collecting their bags. The curtain to business class opened, and the flow toward the door began. David kept a hand near his daughter's shoulder as they stepped into the aisle. When they reached the front, the captain was still there. His voice was quieter now. "Miss Monroe, Mr. Monroe, I want you to know that the crew supports you. This kind of behavior is not acceptable on my aircraft or in my profession." David gave a small nod. "Thank you, Captain. That means more than you know." Aaliyah offered a faint smile. "Thank you for stepping in when you did." As they stepped into the jet bridge, a sudden burst of camera flashes met them. Someone had tipped off the media. Two reporters called out questions, but David guided his daughter forward without answering. Clara moved quickly ahead, creating a path. In the terminal, security officers stood watch as the group moved toward the exit. A few passengers from the flight were already talking to reporters, their voices carrying bits of the story into the air. Margaret fell into step beside Aaliyah. "This is where the real work begins." Aaliyah nodded. She understood. The incident had ended in the cabin, but its impact was only starting to ripple outward. As they reached the car, waiting at the curb, David opened the door for his daughter. Before she got in, she looked back at the terminal. Through the glass, she could still see passengers from their flight, some watching her, some speaking into phones. She knew the narrative could go either way. She had seen it happen before, but she also knew something else. She had faced him down without losing herself. And that mattered. David closed the door behind her, and the car pulled away from the curb. The night outside was warm, the city alive with lights. Inside the car, the quiet felt different than it had on the plane. It was no longer tense. It was the quiet before the next step. The ride from the airport to the hotel was short, but Aaliyah Monroe felt the press of the outside world even before the car reached the lobby entrance. Photographers were gathered near the revolving doors, their lenses glinting under the streetlights. David Monroe sat beside her, phone in hand, scanning the flood of notifications. "It's already everywhere," he said quietly. Clips from the flight, passenger tweets, grainy cell phone shots. They're running with it. Clara Reeves, seated in the front passenger seat, turned slightly. Some are sympathetic, others are twisting it into something it's not. We have a small window to shape the narrative before it calcifies. Aaliyah looked out the tinted window at the cluster of reporters waiting in the warm Los Angeles night. "Then we start now." As they entered the hotel, security ushered them through a side entrance. Margaret Wells followed close behind, her posture upright, eyes scanning the lobby. In the elevator, Clara handed her phone to Aaliyah. "This is the interview request queue. Every major outlet has reached out. CNN, The Times, even a morning show. Aaliyah scrolled slowly, then passed it back. We choose carefully. One outlet for the full story. No sound bites that can be twisted. Margaret nodded, and we tell it calmly. The power will be in your composure, not in raising your voice. In the suite. David sat at the small dining table, opening his laptop. Clara plugged in her phone and began organizing the timeline of events. Margaret moved to the window, pulling the curtains closed. Aaliyah took a seat in the armchair and closed her eyes for a moment. The hum of the city outside was different from the steady engine noise of the plane. It carried a different kind of energy, one that demanded you keep moving. Her mind replayed the moment Dalton had been escorted off, his refusal to apologize, his smirk before the captain intervened. She had stayed silent then, because it was the only way to keep the power in her court. But silence after landing could let the wrong version of the story win. David's voice broke through her thoughts. It's already trending under multiple hashtags, some supportive, some dismissive, a few calling it an overreaction. This is going to escalate. Clara set down her phone. I have an idea. We release a single statement tonight, not to the media directly, but on Luminary's official page. That way, your words are untouched, and the public has something concrete before the networks spin it. Aaliyah opened her eyes. Make sure it's about more than me. This isn't just my seat that was stolen. It's about what it means when people think they can decide who belongs. Margaret gave a small smile. That's the line. That's the anchor of this story. For the next hour, they worked. Clara drafted, Margaret refined. David fact-checked every detail against the flight records and the incident log provided by the captain. Aaliyah read each version, cutting anything that felt like it was written for drama rather than truth. When it was finished, the statement was short but unshakable. On Flight 472, my assigned seat was taken by someone who believed I did not belong there. It was not about comfort. It was not about a misunderstanding. It was about assumption. The assumption that someone who looks like me could not have earned their place. This is not new. It happens every day in boardrooms, in classrooms, and, as I experienced, in the air. My hope is not for punishment alone, but for recognition that belonging is not granted by perception. It is earned by presence, by preparation, and by persistence. They posted it. Within minutes, the reactions began flooding in. Margaret, seated by the window, read them aloud occasionally. Here's one from a teacher in Chicago says she's showing it to her students tomorrow. Here's another from a pilot says he's embarrassed this happened in his industry. But there were others too. Skeptics questioning if she was exaggerating. Strangers demanding to know her net worth as if it changed the nature of the insult. Aaliyah read them without flinching. They will say whatever they need to keep from facing the truth. David's phone rang. It was a private number. He answered, listening without speaking for almost a full minute before hanging up. That was a producer from an investigative show. They're looking into Dalton. Apparently, this is not the first time he's pulled something like this. Clara raised her eyebrows. That changes everything. If this becomes a pattern of behavior, the airline will have to respond more forcefully. Margaret tapped her fingers lightly on the armrest. And if they don't, then it becomes a story about their silence. They agreed to give no interviews until the investigative piece was ready. Instead, Clara began coordinating with passengers from the flight who had recorded the incident. Consent forms were sent. Video files were transferred, and a secure archive was built. By midnight, the suite was quiet except for the soft hum of electronics charging. Aaliyah sat on the couch, her knees drawn up, looking at the city lights through the small gap in the curtains. David came over, setting a glass of water on the coffee table. You should rest. Tomorrow will be heavier than today. "I know," she said softly. Then, after a pause, "Do you ever wonder if speaking up is worth it?" When the noise gets so loud, David looked at her for a long moment. "I wonder every time. But I also remember that silence is not the absence of noise. It's the presence of someone else's story filling the space." She nodded slowly. In the early hours of the morning, as the city finally began to quiet, Aaliyah drifted to sleep. The suite was dark except for the faint blue glow of Clara's laptop screen. On it was a map of media coverage expanding like ripples in water, reaching farther every hour. The storm had only just begun. By the time the sun rose over Los Angeles, the story was no longer just a trending topic. It had become a headline in nearly every major news outlet. Video from the flight was on the morning shows, the grainy cell phone footage showing Henry Dalton leaning across the aisle, his words sharp enough to carry even without perfect audio. In the hotel suite, Aaliyah Monroe stood by the window, her phone in hand. She could see the small crowd of reporters gathered outside on the sidewalk. David Monroe came up behind her, placing a coffee cup in her free hand. "They're not going away any time soon," he said. "I know," she replied, her voice calm. "That means they're still listening." Clara Reeves was already at the dining table, laptop open, earbuds in as she listened to the first cut of the investigative piece. Margaret Wells sat beside her, jotting notes on a yellow legal pad. "It's strong," Clara said, pulling one earbud out. "They've got 3 other incidents involving Dalton, all on record. All similar." Margaret nodded. "That means this isn't just a personal issue. It's a pattern. And patterns are what make institutions act." A knock at the door drew David's attention. Security checked through the peephole before opening it for a woman in a tailored navy suit. She carried a slim folder and introduced herself as a senior representative from the airline's corporate office. "Miss Monroe, Mr. Monroe, we wanted to speak with you before the piece airs tonight," she began. David gestured for her to sit. "Go ahead." The woman's voice was measured. "We understand the seriousness of the situation and the public attention it's receiving. Our immediate concern is ensuring your safety and the safety of our passengers. We would like to offer a formal apology, a private settlement, and a statement of commitment to address bias awareness training across our crews." Aaliyah met her eyes. "Training is fine. But this isn't just about one crew or one passenger. It's about the systems that allow this to keep happening. If you want to address it, you need policy, not just workshops." The representative hesitated, then nodded. "What kind of policy mandatory accountability reporting for all first-class incidents? Passenger removal logs reviewed quarterly by an independent board, and a public transparency report so passengers can see the data. If the numbers show bias, you fix it, and you do it publicly." David leaned forward slightly. "She's not asking for charity. She's asking for measurable change." The woman scribbled notes, promising to take the proposal back to the board. By early afternoon, the tension in the room had shifted. Everyone was waiting for the evening broadcast. Clara coordinated with the investigative team to ensure they had all the footage from the flight. Margaret double-checked the facts in the statement Aaliyah would make afterward. When the segment aired, it was more than just a news story. It was a timeline of Dalton's behavior, backed by interviews with past passengers, crew members, and a behavioral analyst who spoke to the patterns of entitlement and prejudice that had been documented. The footage from Flight 472 was the centerpiece. It showed Dalton taking Aaliyah's seat, ignoring the boarding pass in her hand. It captured his comments about earning a place in first class, the way he leaned back in his seat as if the confrontation were beneath him. And then it showed the moment the captain stood in front of him and told him to leave. The anchor's voice was clear at the close of the segment. This incident raises questions about how airlines handle passenger misconduct and whether deeper systemic issues are at play. For now, Miss Monroe's calm response has sparked a national conversation on belonging and respect. Minutes after the segment ended, Aaliyah's phone began lighting up with messages from friends, from business leaders, from strangers who had seen themselves in her story. Clara refreshed the Luminary Learning homepage. Traffic just spiked tenfold. People are not just reading your statement, they're signing up for the work we do. Margaret smiled faintly. That's the kind of momentum you cannot buy. But Aaliyah knew momentum needed direction. She opened her notes app and began typing her response for the press conference they had agreed to hold the next morning. When she stepped onto the small stage set up in a conference room at the hotel, the air was thick with the buzz of cameras and whispered speculation. She stood behind the podium, adjusting the microphone once before speaking. "I am not here to retell the story you have all seen," she began. "I am here to remind you that this is not a story about a seat. It is about a belief, the belief that some people do not belong in certain places. That belief is old, it is harmful, and it is wrong." Her voice was steady, but her eyes scanned the room, locking with one reporter after another. This belief shows up in ways big and small. In who gets interrupted in meetings, in who gets extra screening at the airport, in who gets told to move, even when their ticket says otherwise. I did not plan to be the face of this conversation, but I will not step back from it either. She outlined the policy changes she had proposed to the airline, calling on other carriers to adopt similar measures. She thanked the passengers who had spoken up during the flight and the crew members who had acted quickly. She also acknowledged those who had stayed silent. "Silence is easy," she said. "It feels safe. But it is the quiet that lets harm keep happening. If you remember anything from this, remember that belonging should never depend on someone else's permission." When she finished, the room was still for a moment before the questions began. She answered only a few, repeating her focus on systemic change. Later, back in the suite, David placed a hand on her shoulder. "You know this is just the beginning." "Right." She nodded. "That's the point." Margaret raised her glass of water. "To the beginning, then." Clara smiled, "And to the end of pretending it's not happening." They clinked glasses softly. Outside, the city lights stretched toward the horizon. Somewhere out there, other flights were boarding. Other passengers were finding their seats. And maybe, because of today, one less person would be told they did not belong. Aaliyah sat by the window again as night settled in. She thought about how the day had begun, with Dalton's words in the cabin, and how it was ending, with her words carried far beyond the walls of the hotel. The seat had been taken from her for a moment, but her place, her real place, had never been in question. By the time Aaliyah Monroe stepped off that plane, the world was already listening. What started as one stolen seat became a catalyst for change, not just for her, but for anyone who's ever been told they didn't belong. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't lash out. Instead, she stood her ground with a calm strength that dismantled arrogance more effectively than any argument could. And, because of that, airlines will now have to look closer at how bias operates in the spaces we trust to be safe. But as inspiring as her story is, it's also a reminder that these moments still happen. That somewhere, right now, someone is being made to feel smaller because of who they are, not what they've done. The fight against discrimination isn't just about punishing the guilty. It's about making sure dignity is never negotiable. If Aaliyah's courage moved you, let it be more than a story you hear. Let it be a reason to speak up, to stand with those who are silenced, and to demand better from the spaces we share. Like this video, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe for more stories that speak truth to power.